Once again, and for the last time today, I will say thank you for joining us at the Winds of Change event at Duke University, where we're diving deep into the practical realities of offshore wind development. This panel is going to focus on the potential environmental impacts and wildlife. Again, the session is being live streamed and recorded, and now I'm going to hand it off to our moderator, Emily Schumchenia. Emily.
All right, thank you, Brian. Good to see everyone here today. Thank you for sticking around for the last panel of the day, potential impacts for wildlife and environment. We have a really great panel with us up here today. I'm just going to briefly introduce us before getting started. My name is Emily Schumchenia. I lead the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative for Offshore Wind, which I'll describe a little bit more in a bit. But to my right, we also have Holly Goyert from ACOM, Senior Wildlife Biologist. We're also joined by Brian Hooker, Biology Team Lead at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. This panel is rigged with a Duke faculty member, Doug Nowacek, the Repass Rogers Professor of Conservation Technology. And lastly, Francine Kershaw, Senior Scientist at the Natural Resources Defense Council. So welcome to our panelists. Just to provide, I'm going to try to change the slides here. Here we go. To provide a little bit more context about why I'm your moderator today and a little bit more about this topic, I wanted to introduce the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative. Each of the panelists here actually is a member and participant in RWSC, as we call it, and there are many more of you out in the audience as well. This is a relatively new group that was collaboratively established, is led and is funded by federal agencies, all of the Atlantic coast states, all of the offshore wind developers on the Atlantic coast, and many ENGOs, national and local scale ENGOs. And they all contribute to funding this collaborative, which is set up to coordinate and convene folks around more efficient and coordinated data collection on the environment and wildlife with respect to offshore wind. So the goal is to understand regional scale questions about potential impacts to offshore wind to the environment and ensure that as we do that, we're doing it in an efficient manner. So for example, we know that many federal agencies and states are financing their own research and conducting their own data collection activities related to their responsibilities, regulatory and management responsibilities, but we also have offshore wind developers that are collecting data sets. And so there's a huge opportunity. If we all coordinate together and understand what each of us is doing, we can pool those data someday and have a really nice big picture understanding of our coast, of our ocean, and this new development, new set of activities that will be occurring over the next several decades. So the RWSC is really set up to help enable that, and all of those members contribute to that end. Our main source of work right now, our main focus is to develop this integrated science plan that'll articulate the existing research priorities out there related to offshore wind and wildlife, things that folks have already identified over the last decade or so of thinking about this and planning for this eventuality. We are compiling information about all of the active data collection and research that's already going on, and there's a surprising amount already happening, even though we don't have large-scale development yet. If you go to our website at rwse.org/database, you'll find a huge, essentially right now it's in the form of a spreadsheet, but it catalogs all of the active data collection and research that we've been hearing from our partners and stakeholders with information about what data is being collected, why they're collecting it, and what part of the ecosystem it focuses on. So we'll be looking at that database and then identifying what gaps and needs still remain. We're doing a great job, but what else needs to be done to be able to answer the questions we care about and ensure that offshore wind is being developed in a responsible way and we're understanding any potential impacts. And then a couple other important parts are standardizing data collection and facilitating data sharing so that we are able to pool these data someday and look across all of the different studies to understand change at a broader, more regional level. And of course, aligning funding and using our funds in an efficient way so that if we have resources from feds and states and ENGOs and offshore wind developers, we're using them together towards common goals in an efficient way, avoiding redundancy, and building something bigger, a bigger understanding than what we would be able to accomplish if we each did it alone. That science plan, by the way, will be out in draft form in probably about 3 months. So we're looking at mid-2023 to release those findings and set a research agenda. I'd put a slide up here of just some of our recent accomplishments since we've formed and since we launched in July of 2021. We've already been coordinating around a lot of different research activities, particular surveys, studies, releasing some guidance and best practices for data storage and data management towards that, efficient and coordinated data collection goal that we have. And I'm not going to read these to you, but the most important one is at the bottom. We are a partner in the project WOW, the Wildlife Offshore Wind project that has been mentioned throughout the day today. And we're really excited to see that start to collect some field data, hopefully coming up soon. And we've been a key part of that team and look forward to continuing. So what I asked the panelists to talk about today, we are in the Southern Atlantic region of our focal area. So the RWSE, its purview is the entire Atlantic coast where offshore wind is being planned or developed. So we do just have this East Coast focus. And we spend a lot of time talking about the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic because of the stage of offshore wind development up there. So I thought for today, we would focus a little bit further south given where we are. And I asked each of the panelists to comment a little bit about maybe some of the unique things about this region from an ecological perspective and from an offshore wind development perspective. We're at a different phase down here in terms of the progress of the projects. Like I mentioned, Northeast is a few steps ahead, but the Southern Atlantic will be able to learn from those lessons, and I'm sure we'll catch up really soon to that phasing. So each panelist here has their own area of expertise and experience, and commenting a little bit about this particular geography is something you may hear from them. So with that, we'll just reintroduce our panelists, and I'll actually just hand it over to you guys one by one. So let's move on to Holly.
Thank you. So thanks for having me at this panel today. My title is Senior Wildlife Ecologist at AECOM, but I consider myself a quantitative marine ecologist, and I lead the Atlantic Marine Bird Cooperative Working Group for Marine Spatial Planning. So one thing we did in the past was write a technical review of the BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management Avian Survey Guidelines, and that led to the development of a displacement committee to provide recommendations on post-construction guidelines for birds under the Environmental Technical Working Group of in the state of New York. And our current initiative is evaluating compensatory mitigation planning for birds affected by offshore wind energy development. So today, I'll give you an overview of what impacts birds face, well, seabirds in particular, from offshore wind development. I'll then mention what kinds of data we have offshore the Carolinas to assess impacts in this region. And then last, I'll discuss how to reduce or mitigate some adverse effects to achieve net gain from offshore wind. So what are the impacts that seabirds face? As you know, rising ocean temperatures from global climate change pose one of the most important or greatest threats to seabird populations, given that resulting changes in prey distributions have caused mass starvations of seabirds. And you may have heard of examples in the state of Maine and in Alaska in recent years. So offshore wind energy has the potential to positively impact seabirds by improving foraging habitat through artificial reef effects and, of course, reducing atmospheric carbon emissions to stabilize the climate. However, seabirds are vulnerable to two main stressors from offshore wind. These are collision and displacement risk. So in this example shown here, a bird may collide directly with a wind turbine on its way to find food. So collision risk can occur when aerial seabirds fly within the rotor swept zone, and risk can increase when conditions are poor, for example, during high winds or poor visibility. And alternatively, if a bird avoids wind turbines altogether, it loses an opportunity to feed. So this is what we call displacement, and that can result in habitat loss. Displacement risk can occur at wind facilities that have been sited in areas that were originally used to access foraging or breeding grounds. And while some species are known to avoid turbines, that can obviously reduce collision risk, but can increase displacement from foraging areas. On the flip side, wind turbine foundations may serve as artificial reefs, like we heard a little bit about today, and that could improve foraging habitat potentially for other species. But then again, if this increases attraction, it could generate increased collision risk. So to achieve net gain from offshore wind, we need to be able to estimate whether collision and displacement risk is low or high. And collision risk models are currently under development by the Fish and Wildlife Service and BOEM, but there's a lot of uncertainty around flight heights, whether those birds are flying within the rotor swept zone, and also their attraction or avoidance rates. Additionally, the rotor swept zone has more than doubled since the first wind facilities were installed offshore Rhode Island in 2016. So the exposure to wind has more than doubled, basically, to aerial seabirds that are flying within the rotor swept zone. And unique to wind energy is the difficulty in quantifying bird fatalities from collision. That's because bodies fall into the water and they disappear quickly. So emerging technologies have been developed. For example, they can detect collisions using cameras and vibration sensors, and they've been tested in onshore wind farms, but they have not yet been verified for use offshore. So because collision risk models are not yet validated in the offshore realm, avian risk assessments in the US have tended to focus on assessing seabird exposure and then vulnerability to impacts from offshore wind. So how do we assess avian exposure? And this is where we want to look at not only seabird movement using tracking studies, but also map their distribution and abundance from boat-based or aerial surveys. So this can involve very rigorous predictive modeling approaches to evaluate where and when seabirds are at risk of encountering proposed wind energy projects. What does that mean that we have in terms of baseline data offshore the Carolinas? So to inform this, from 2018 to 2020, BOEM funded 2 years of 8 high-resolution digital aerial surveys on the Atlantic Outer Continental Shelf. So these are about up to 50 nautical miles offshore, or about 100 kilometers. And then within the Carolina Long Bay wind energy area, which you can see here on the right, that's offshore Wilmington, they conducted 10% grid coverage, and they recorded marine birds, also marine mammals, fishes, and turtles. So high densities of birds occurred in the wind energy area, as we might expect during spring migration when they're flying up the coast from South America. As far as species that are federally and state listed offshore the Carolinas, terns are most recognizable in terms of seabird species. And they were additionally present not only during spring migration, but also during the post-breeding or pre-migratory season in the fall. So and in particular, the state listed species identified in these regions are common terns and gold-billed terns, which are a very good example of species with high collision and displacement vulnerability to offshore wind, especially given their population sensitivity due to their protected status. So how then do we reduce potential adverse effects of offshore wind energy on high-risk seabird populations like terns to achieve net gain? So this is where the mitigation hierarchy comes into play, and I think we'll hear a little bit more about this later today. But basically, mitigation is defined as measures that avoid, minimize, and compensate for effects from a proposed action. And this is where effects or impacts are include both direct, indirect, as well as cumulative effects. So in the context of offshore wind, The first step at the base of the foundation involves siting planning areas away from biological hotspots or away from areas of high use to avoid risk to birds. And that, however, there may be instances where impacts could be unavoidable. And in that case comes the second step. That's where we minimize risk to birds. And that could be through best management practices or emerging technologies, like I mentioned before, that could include deterrence, what's also referred to as smart curtailment. That's where turbines may be shut down based on various conditions. And there have been studies onshore to suggest that it's an effective minimization tool to reduce collisions of bats with turbines. However, the verdict's still out and there exists a lot of uncertainty surrounding its effectiveness on birds. Also, like I said before, many of these emerging technologies have not yet been verified or validated offshore. So that means that the third step is to compensate for losses so that the benefits to birds outweigh the costs. And conventionally, for example, for onshore wind, this has been accomplished through mitigation banks, restoration projects, or habitat acquisition that can offset losses. And while this means that we have to remember avoiding and minimizing are always prioritized. They're challenging for offshore wind once facilities are already in the water. So that's why it's very important to initiate the discussion of compensatory mitigation early. And in risk assessments, it's difficult to evaluate the overall net impact of wind energy on birds, whether it's beneficial or detrimental, because it can be very site specific, it can be season specific, species specific, and sometimes studies have even shown specific to individual behaviors within a species. So that means that mitigation planning is very important to establish a net positive impact of wind energy on birds. And it's only effective with rigorous pre and post-construction monitoring data to gauge the need for mitigation and to verify the effectiveness of mitigation measures. So that's one of the efforts that we've been involved in, like I mentioned earlier, basically looking into mitigation, growing and saving birds. I think I'll pass it on to the next speaker and we can talk. Oh, that wasn't supposed to be there.
Nope.
These are, oh, this is yours?
That's mine.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it is supposed to be there. Thanks, Holly. Hi again, my name is Brian Hooker, and I work in the environment branch for renewable energy. So we're the group that does all the environmental review of all the offshore wind projects on the Atlantic that we've been talking about today. And also Nicholas School alum, so happy to be back on the Durham campus. So I really want to start off with, where does, in the context of everything we've heard today, there's been a couple of slides that taught that. I think there was a slide earlier on today that had offshore, onshore, hard constraints, and all of that is extremely important. And what goes into the far left of the slide on the screen of planning and analysis. And that's the first step where we're considering impacts to wildlife. And I mentioned I was a Nicholas School alum, and so I'll say that that's where all of Pat Halpin's spatial ecology, coursework comes in handy. So if you got to pay attention, that's where the still doing command line requirements for that? No, not anymore. That's where that comes into place. We take all the the spatial information that we have on marine wildlife and other constraints, those hard constraints that you saw earlier today from Department of Defense, from looking at what's the buildable environment for this, what's the deepest that these structures can go in, and all of those go into that initial planning and analysis phase, where we eventually come out with through the area identification process, we have a wind energy area. And so from the very beginning, we're ingesting all the information that we can to try to identify the least conflicted spaces on the outer continental shelf to site these facilities. So once we get through that process, and we work closely with our state federal task force processes, there's a North Carolina state task force. There's regional task forces where there's, kind of multiple states all focused on probably getting procurements from some of those sites. And that involves state, local, tribal, and other federal partners on those task forces to get input into the process. And even more recently, with some leasing that we've been doing in the Central Atlantic, the Gulf of Maine on the Atlantic, we've been partnering with NOAA's National Ocean Service and their spatial ecology folks, and kind of enhancing that effort that we've been doing from the beginning. So then once we get to an actual area, after a draft wind energy area or even a final wind energy area, that's when we do our first environmental consultation, formal consultation with the National Marine Fisheries Service and other federal partners, the Fish and Wildlife Service, I see we have here as well. And looking at what the effects of lease issuance is for those areas prior to leasing. So we do an environmental impact assessment and environmental consultations for the issuance of leases. And that includes, site assessment, the placement of meteorological buoys on the seafloor and site characterization. So that's the geophysical surveys that have been somewhat in the news lately, where that's where we analyze the effects of those activities and consult with the National Marine Fisheries Service on the effects of those activities. We do that programmatically, usually at the time of lease sale. We've done, gone through kind of several rounds over this since the implementation of the program, going back to the first lease sales, probably in that 2012 timeframe. So we've been doing this for many years, and there's now a broad programmatic consultation that we have in place for all new leases on the East Coast, and that's all on our website. So once we, do that, the leases are issued, and the lessees at that point begin some of those analysis of their own, like trying to get the information necessary to develop their construction and operations plan. And this is the first time where we're actually getting, the construction and operations plan is when we're actually first getting, better information on what they actually plan to construct in the offshore environment. And I'm really glad that we had Manisha from Federal Permitting Infrastructure Steering Council earlier, FIPSI. And it really shows like how many agencies are all involved in that. So most of our East Coast projects, I think all of our East Coast projects right now are on that FAST 41 dashboard. And I highly recommend you do go to permitting.gov, and you can see where each project is in the permitting timeline. I know I use it because I get lost sometimes with all the projects that we have going on. That's where we're, coordinating with all these different federal agencies, once we do that notice of intent to prepare the EIS and begin that, approximately 2-year process to get to a decision, a record of decision at the end. And that is, a very rigorous process, with multiple opportunities for public engagement. And I think I did highlight. So here's what I highlighted here is those 2 formal consultation points that we have in our process. But again, I want to stress there's also informal consultation points that we have inserted through our process throughout the entire process of getting to lease to project approval. So that's where we are right now with a lot of projects on the Atlantic, is in our construction and operation plan review. We have 2 projects that we have permitted in Southern New England, the South Fork Wind Project and the Vineyard Wind Project. We have 2 more that are we hope to reach records of decision on this spring and summer. And if you take an opportunity to look at those leases, those terms and conditions of COP approval, you'll see a whole list of environmental conditions that we add to their project. So not only do we have lessees that are out there proposing to BOEM as part of their proposed action things that they would like to do for the protection of wildlife, through our consultations and through public feedback, BOEM may add or adjust additional requirements on top of that. And as you can imagine, with everything you've heard today, with all of the different entities all kind of weighing in on all these conditions to their permits. And this is just one permit. This is, BOEM has the target on our back sometimes as the lead permit agency, but as you saw today, there are many agencies involved both in the offshore and onshore environment. BOEM has that lead status. And so we're all contributing all these different permit requirements to them. And it does, it's there to, reduce that environmental risk, but it also does, potentially increase the cost of getting that project built as well. I think, and so I do have control here. I can go to the next slide. So I think this is saying a lot of the things I just said. Here's another map. I think we had a map earlier of some of the areas, but these are the actual lease areas. And again, what I was trying to reiterate here is that prior to lease issuance, we do analyze those impacts. And then again, prior to approval, we consult on all those as well. And in addition, I think, what Emily was talking about with the RWSC and her database that she has on all the different studies that are going on and how to then prioritize. There's projects that BOEM is doing, projects that Department of Energy is funding, academia, state-led projects. There's a lot of activities going on there to support this industry, and it's sometimes lost when you're focused on what has BOEM studied or what was peer reviewed. And I just want to reassure folks there's a lot of money and effort being put into the science behind all of this and how not only to model, but also out there for the 2 demonstration projects that we have with Block Island Wind Farm and Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Farm is actually out there evaluating and looking at how those projects are interacting with the environment. So I think that's all I wanted to primarily touch on in my 2 slides before I hand it over to Doug.
Thanks, Brian. I'll need the clicker there. Thanks. But actually, I'm going to leave that slide up. Well, actually, I'm going to come back to it in just a second. But thanks again for everybody being here. I'm Doug Nowacek. I'm a faculty member here at Duke in the School of the Environment and the School of Engineering, although I get to live down at the coast in Beaufort. So lucky me. And welcoming back alums is a great part of actually what's happened today. So there's quite a few that have come back. So one thing I wanted to touch on, and I'll get to some of the specific parts of threats to marine mammals is Project WOW. And I just make the acronyms and then wave my arms a little bit and a miracle happens and it all gets done. I do want to take just a minute to describe this in a couple ways, but I'm going to flash back to Brian's last slide because when the call came out from the Department of Energy for this project that we eventually won, it was calling on, I can't remember the exact terminology, but the end of it was from Maine to the Carolinas. And so trying to sample wildlife from Maine to the Carolinas and do it takes 2 of us, and I mean 2 of us, meaning Project WOW and the RWSC, to try and keep all these things, all these plates spinning with regard to it, in addition to all the data collection being done privately and publicly and so on. So I do want to give a big shout out to everybody that's collecting data, not just, certainly not just us on the RWSC for their leadership in this and their partnership in this. It's really turning into a super partnership. So, but for Project WOW itself, it is funded by the Department of Energy and co-funded by BOEM. And it is a cooperative agreement. And so we work closely with the agency representatives, and some of them are actually here. I'm really delighted to have them here and have a chance to chat about things. But to focus just on the project itself for just a minute, my 2 co-PIs here at Duke are in the room and are a big part of today's thing. In fact, the lead on it, Brian Murray, is a co-PI on Project WOW, and his main role, among others, is to be the liaison with our external advisory board, which I'll come back to in just a minute. The other co-PI is Pat Halpin, who's in the room here with us and leads the Marine Geospatial Ecology Lab at Duke, and he's had an outsized influence on alums from our environmental management program. There's many students who've gone through and gotten their geospatial ecology certificate with Pat's lab and gone on to use that for the force of good. So the project itself is set up to, the first year has been a data aggregation exercise and working with RWSC. What data sources exist, what's where, what are the species that need attention. And I should say, as you can see, hopefully in the logo, it's marine mammals, it's birds, and it's bats. And so we're not going to get through to bats today, but we can certainly field some questions about them. So the focus is on a spread of taxonomic groups as well as geographic spread. But the first year, and the project is multi-institutional. So we have everybody from ecological modelers at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland to physical oceanographers at Rutgers to acousticians at Syracuse and Cornell, the New England Aquarium, Wildlife Conservation Society. So it's quite a team, and I'm lucky and honored to lead it. It's a lot to keep going, but it's just a great team to be working with. So as the first years we aggregate the data, we're also identifying some areas that we can help out in terms of data collection, as Emily mentioned, which is set to start in June. And we've looked at a couple of areas, and I'll just go to the species that we're focused on. So northern gannets, blackback gulls, red-throated loons, and red bats. And then on the marine mammal side, we are really at this point focusing on the large whales, on the mysticetes in the area, and that's North Atlantic right whales, humpbacks, minkies, and fin whales. There are certainly a lot of Odontocetes in the area. Most of the concern as far as construction noise goes, which I'll come to in a minute, is around the large whales, and so thus the focus on those species. So the other part of the first year is identifying data gaps of what and we can't hope to fill all of them, and some of them we won't be able to fill, like knowing what a baleen whale can actually hear. But nonetheless, we're narrowing in on those species as we move through. So then sort of the middle part of the project, it's a 5-year project, is to work on filling those data gaps while continually feeding back into those frameworks of risk assessment and research paradigms. Okay, so what are the threats to the potential threats to marine mammals? Oh, my slide didn't get up there. It should say potential threats because they're not all, again, we don't know what they hear. And I guess that's a little small to read. I can't read it, but that's all right. I know what it says. I wrote it. So on the acoustic side, that slide shows more or less, it's from the Oceanography Society, the acoustic threats to marine mammals of the whole operation through operations. You could also have the decommissioning part of it. But as the site assessment goes along, this is very good segue from Brian's talk. Some of the site assessment work to look at the bottom structure. As you drive monopiles into it, you need to know what the bottom is made out of and whether there are no shallow gas hazards and things. And those are geophysical surveys. And I won't go through all the surveys, but some are higher resolution than others, using different frequency bands, and we can get into that in the Q&A. The baleen whales are low frequency animals for the most part, and the low frequency sources are seismic in nature. Some of them quite different and comparatively a lot quieter than traditional large air gun arrays used for research and oil and gas exploration. But there are low, mid, and high frequency sources being used in this whole enterprise. Most of them are, as the sort of diagram shows, are very well focused down towards the bottom. And in fact, with some of the new technology for the ROVs that are going down and surveying just above the bottom, with the source being that close to the bottom, there's less opportunity for noise to spread, but nonetheless, it does reverberate. So those are some of the acoustic threats. And again, the potential threats, because for starters, we don't, like I said, with the baleen whales, we don't know what they can hear. There's no audiogram. You can't put headphones on a baleen whale and ask it to raise its flipper when it hears a sound in one ear or the other. So that's, we'll leave it there. I'm sure my guess is there'll be questions about it. I did throw some as far as on the construction side, this activity is mitigatable, and I think that's an important thing to discuss. And there's a lot of work been done on it. We've convened some really interesting things on noise related to offshore renewables. But what you see here is a construction platform with a bubble curtain around it. The bubbles act to knock down the sound. It can be quite effective, like somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 12 dB, and it doesn't sound like a lot, but it is. It's logarithmic. And also a single bubble curtain does a lot, but double bubble does even more. So these mitigation techniques can be quite effective, and they're more or less depending on what the construction conditions are like and currents and things like that. But I as far as the animals are concerned, there's several levers to pull, and this is one of them. Another one is time area activity. So just avoiding the times when animals are around. Okay, then entanglement is on there. Again, sorry, it's so small, but the entanglement issue for large whales, entanglement is a big problem for large whales. I'll come to that in a minute. From the offshore wind development, the primary concern at the moment, at least as I understand it, is in the floating arena and the cables that anchor those floating platforms to the bottom, and really a secondary entanglement of ghost gear or other gear getting caught on those cables and then entangling a whale. It's something we need to understand. We don't really have a great way of estimating what the chances are of that, or how the animals will respond if they bump into one of those cables or the net that's on it. Okay, then I think the last thing I wanted to bring up, and this has gotten some attention recently, and this diagram is for the mechanical engineers and the fluid dynamics folks in the audience, of which I think there's one that I know of anyway. Could be a mechanical engineering student out there who knows a little bit about it. What you're seeing is the downstream wake of water flow past a wind turbine foundation. And so what I've labeled there is the downwind and downstream effects of having large wind farms has gotten a lot of attention recently, and something that I know that is actively being their support to investigate it. And without getting into it too much, the concern is that having the turbines in the water and also the actual turbines themselves taking energy out of the wind could have impacts on the oceanography downwind and downstream of those areas. It's interesting because the turbine foundations, the monopiles or whatever they are, actually probably act to increase mixing a little bit because of the vortices that are shed off the back of the turbines. The concern on the downwind side is that the turbines taking energy out takes energy away from what the wind does to mix the ocean, which is actually non-trivial. And there's a lot of wind-driven mixing in the ocean, and also aggregating forces where the wind acts with the tides and things to aggregate or create tidal fronts. You're all accustomed to seeing tidal front, maybe you're not, I don't know. So this is a concern. To me, it's a really interesting area. It's an interesting question. I think there have been some conclusions drawn about it before we know enough. There is some good data from the North Sea in Europe. It's a very different body of water, but nonetheless, some interesting, like some localized increases in primary production, but on the regional scale, it's undetectable. So I think we need to look at this and keep it in mind. Okay, then I also wanted to talk, and I know Francine is also going to talk about right whales, so I will try not to steal her thunder. North Atlantic right whales are a primary concern in the North Atlantic and wind development. They certainly occur off North Carolina. We disentangled one just a few weeks ago. Well, all I did was ride around on the boat. So North Atlantic right whales are concerned that the population is in decline. The primary threats to that population are entanglement and fishing gear and ship strikes. In fact, I think sadly the statistic is that of all the right whales that have died in the last 25 years, that were not perinatal deaths. All of them that we know the cause of, we're able to determine have been anthropogenic causes, and those are entanglement and ship strikes. So no natural mortalities that we know of in the last 25 years. So these are the threats to right whales. There is concern about this downwind and downstream effects that I just discussed, that it may impact the oceanography in such a way to impact the food of baleen whales in general. And I think that's we can't add it to this picture in my mind yet, because we don't know enough. And these are the things that are really impacting right whales. So I'll leave it at that. Project WOW is not really at all focused on these two sources of mortality or potential impact at all, but it's an important part to the whole story, the whole discussion about offshore wind and marine mammals. Okay, I think that's it. Francine.
Thank you. Thanks, Doug. And that was actually really helpful because I'm not duplicative at all with what I was going to say. So that was perfect. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Francine Kershaw. I'm a senior scientist with the Natural Resources Defense Council, or NRDC, which is an environmental NGO. So I'm bringing a slightly different perspective to this panel. In my role at NRDC, I've worked in the offshore wind space for about the last 5 years or so. And I've been largely focused on developing guidelines and standards to support offshore wind develop rapidly, but also in a way that minimizes and avoids impacts to marine wildlife and habitats, with a particular focus on marine mammals, because that is my training. So I'm going to start by saying that NRDC views offshore wind development as absolutely critical to meeting our national climate goals. It promises healthier air. It promises thousands of well-paying clean energy jobs. So we need offshore wind, and we cannot delay in how quickly we need to deploy it out there on the water. But yet, like any type of ocean industry, offshore wind poses some risks to the environment, as Doug described. So because we're also in, unfortunately, a biodiversity crisis. So ocean life is struggling to adapt to climate change while also being stressed by decades of overfishing, habitat destruction, ocean noise, pollution. So it's important to launch the new offshore wind industry in a smart way that protects our valuable and vulnerable ocean wildlife. So this means smart siting decisions, as Holly mentioned, reducing vessel strike risk and other impacts during project development and operations. And most pertinent to this panel, conducting environmental monitoring and research in a way that allows us to learn as we go and solve problems as they arise, because this, we're moving forward in somewhat of an uncertain way here. We're not quite sure, how things are going to go. And so it's so important that we have really rigorous monitoring at every stage of the process. Oh, and responsible development also means promoting equity during each stage of the process too, as previous speakers have mentioned today. So marine mammals are a species group, I would argue, of special concern for offshore wind development in the United States and also in other regions like Europe. All marine mammals that reside in US waters are legally protected by the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and many are also at a status of conservation concern, unfortunately, and so have additional legal protections through the Endangered Species Act. Several large whale species have been experiencing elevated levels of mortality off the East Coast for a number of years now. There are also many small populations of coastal bottlenose dolphins that, because they're a small population, that are relatively higher risk of impacts than larger populations might be. And that's particularly relevant to kind of the mid-Atlantic and Southeast regions, where there's a lot of vulnerable coastal bottlenose dolphins here. There's also acoustically sensitive seal species. And as we get further down into the Southeast, we have manatees. I was telling Doug earlier, I got the opportunity to feed and pet a manatee last week in Puerto Rico, and I was very excited by that. But they're also experiencing a fairly drastic, unusual mortality event at the moment off of Florida. Some of you may be aware of that. And so again, just a high priority vulnerable species to be thinking about. And then as Doug mentioned, critically endangered North Atlantic right whales are, of course, a key priority. There's only about 340 individual whales left. And of those 340, there's only about 70 reproductively capable females left. So if you're a demographics person or a population geneticist like me, you know that reproductive females essentially equals the size of the population, because those are the individuals you have to continue that population or species into the future. So it's a pretty dire situation, and they're still declining rapidly towards extinction. And offshore wind development is already planned throughout much of the species range, with expectations of future expansion into critical habitat for the species that's defined under the Endangered Species Act in the Gulf of Maine. And then critical calving habitat is found for the species in the Southeast region. So in areas off the coast of the Carolinas down through Georgia and Florida. And while offshore wind isn't planned within that critical calving habitat just yet, it is planned immediately adjacent to it off the Carolinas, and some activities associated with that eventual development, such as cable laying or site assessment work, potentially vessel transits, may be intersecting with those critical habitat areas. And so we need to be really proactively thinking about risk reduction measures there. So as we consider offshore wind development, and particularly utility scale build out across multiple lease areas and multiple wind energy areas, we're thinking about several potential impact factors on marine mammals during site assessment, construction, and then longer term operations, and eventually decommissioning, but I haven't been focusing too much on that yet. And then thinking about, the cumulative impacts of that build out across larger scales. And Doug spoke about many of these earlier. I'm not going to list through them, but just so you can see them on the slide. There's a couple here that are more relevant, I think, to maybe those coastal bottlenose dolphin species and other coastal marine mammals. So a challenge is that while we know quite a bit about some of these impact pathways, such as noise and vessel strikes, and as Doug described, there's a lot we know about noise, but there are still some unknowns there too. There's still quite a bit of uncertainty as to if and how impacts will be realized on the water. But given the vulnerability and legal protection of marine mammals, and particularly North Atlantic right whales, we need to be proactively managing for this risk, even in the face of these uncertainties. And this is a pretty tricky line to walk when you want an industry to advance quickly, but you want to make sure that you have the most protective measures possible in place as you do so. So NRDC, in collaboration and coordination with a much larger coalition of environmental groups who are also interested in these dual goals of advancing offshore wind but protecting marine life, we're approaching this challenge by designing risk reduction measures that are precautionary at the outset and based on the best scientific understanding that we currently have. And then critically, we're pairing those measures with a robust monitoring plan and adaptive management framework, which is the little cartoon up here on the slide. So essentially, by learning as we go and using those learnings to adjust costs for subsequent development, the industry can advance responsibly in a manner that, we're continually and improving the way in which risks are reduced going forward, but we're not, slowing down development in the moment. Maybe the most exciting marine mammal picture today. So we've been extremely pleased to see the establishment of the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative, whose good work will enable the development of robust monitoring and research designs, the standardization of data collection practices, which is no mean feat, as any scientist will tell you, and the establishment of open data sharing principles to really enable this regional coordination of learning and science. And all of that will help us truly understand what's happening out there on the water. For example, it could help us understand whether this humpback whale that's hanging out off Chesapeake Bay is planning to be there for a while and if it's planning to bring his friends to spend time. So I'm just going to end pointing to to an initiative that NGOs have been working on around the monitoring issue. So to support a robust monitoring effort, a group of more than 20 environmental organizations developed a concise guide. It started off being a concise guide. I think it's now about 100 pages, but I'll just emphasize that each one of those words has been decided that it is quite important. It's a guide to the science-based principles and priorities for environmental monitoring that our stakeholder group determines and views as crucial to advance offshore wind development in the United States in a responsible way. And one of the reasons it's so long is it offers 2 levels of recommendations. So it offers kind of high-level recommendations that we view as being relevant to every geographic region across the United States. And then there are regional chapters which describe the specific, regional environmental considerations and put a finer point on some of those monitoring recommendations to help tailor it to regional priorities. And by doing that, we're hoping that the document will actually be more useful in the conversations that have been had in, various states and various forums around monitoring and how we prioritize, our resources. The guidance document will also be periodically updated to incorporate additional regions and also reflect the latest scientific and technological advancements, which I think, as we're all aware in this room, are rapidly advancing and are a little difficult to keep up with. And as a sneak peek, these are just some of the more marine mammal focused priorities that emerge for the East Coast. The Mid-Atlantic and Southeast regions are included on there. But the document has other ecosystem level priorities listed that are relevant to marine mammals. And then the document itself includes monitoring recommendations for other taxa, so for sea turtles, birds, bats, fish, and benthic habitat and other habitats as well. So the link is at the bottom of the slide, and I encourage you all to take a look and feel free to reach out if you have questions. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to move into looking at the Slido questions. So if you have questions for any of the panelists and haven't yet entered them, please do that. I am just going to pick one real quick because it's a good clarifying question. I meant to talk about at the very beginning that the panel up here, obviously, and this goes for the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative also, we focus on marine mammals, sea turtles, birds and bats, components of the habitat and ecosystem, but we did not talk about commercial fisheries and commercial fish. And there's a reason for that, and that's because we have a sister organization called the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance that deals with and coordinates and convenes stakeholders around commercially fished species and the fisheries that depend on them. It's a whole different set of stakeholders for that issue, although we are in close collaboration with them because, as we know and we're reminded often, it's a single ecosystem, right? So a lot of the species that are commercially fished interact with other species and the ecosystem and the habitats. And so because of those connections, we continue to coordinate with that group. But our focus today for this panel is certainly on those other species, so non-commercially fished species.
Hey, Emily, can I just pipe in about about Coonamessett Farms?
Sure.
So as in the parallel with RWSC and ROSA, DOE and BOEM funded a parallel program to what became WOW with commercial fisheries project.
It doesn't have a cool acronym.
Doesn't. I know. CFF. I know. And that one was won by the Coonamessett Farm Foundation on Cape Cod, and they will be out sampling commercial fish, and their acronym to come. A few.
Really
Thanks.
good note. Thank you. So this question has the most upvotes. This one's probably for Brian. How do the environmental reviews that occur within BOEM at the planning and analysis phase differ from the construction operations phase?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the planning and analysis phase, we're mainly, if we use Holly's, I finally get to bring in Holly's mitigation hierarchy into place. We're mostly focused on that avoid part, right? So we're trying to avoid, where where impacts could be greatest. So that's what we're primarily doing at the planning and analysis phase. We aren't, we know that eventually that area will be leased for an offshore wind farm, and our proposed sale notices and our call for information and nominations, these are all Federal Register steps, through that planning analysis phase, do ask questions about, the facilities that might be placed there, especially like in the Central Atlantic, and the Gulf of Maine now, where we're talking about floating technology. So getting information about that floating technology and about constraints that floating technology might have in those areas do enter in that planning and analysis phase. But we're not necessarily getting into, impacts of, the cable lay vessel interacting with fishing operations or something along those lines. That gets analyzed at the project stage. So that's the construction and operations plan, where we actually have, here's a project that's being proposed. What are the impacts of what's being proposed on the environment and other human uses? And so that's when we're getting in, using the mitigation hierarchy, getting into the mitigate, and maybe in the future the compensate, where we can probably have a whole nother conversation about compensation in the wildlife area and how that could possibly work. There are some land-based examples of that. I think it's a little tricky in the offshore environment, but it is part of the conversation being had. But that's where that mitigate aspect comes in our consultations and environmental review. I hope that answers it.
Awesome, thanks. And before we let you go completely, this one also has the most upvotes, but it's because you dangled this. What are the two, and I don't know if you can say, but you mentioned that there's some projects that might be advancing this spring. Maybe you can talk just a little bit about the portfolio of projects.
Sure. The next two projects in the pipeline is the Ocean Wind 1 project off of New Jersey and the Revolution Wind project off of Rhode Island and Massachusetts. Those were the two that I was referring to. And if you go to permitting.gov, you can find out when those, I think it's actually being updated right now. But you'll see what the schedule is for final approval of those two projects. But those are the next ones in the pipeline.
Great, thank you.
Well, it's really, the permitting.gov thing is really interesting because it was, I think in the European example, there's like this idea of one-stop shop for, all your permitting needs. And it's not necessarily one-stop shop from permitting, but it does really do, I think, a lot of things that it does put it all out there for the public to see all the different statutory consultations that are going on and where they are in the process. So, yeah, anyway. I wish Fipsy was still here to hear me plugging this.
I know.
I'll second that too. I never thought I'd bookmark something like permitting.gov, but I use it. It is really helpful. You can filter by offshore wind. So definitely check it out. Here's a lob for everybody. How important is data sharing, and is there a path to formalizing requirements for developers to share environmental or monitoring data? So maybe we can hit everybody besides Brian, and then Brian can comment on the required part as the lead agency. But maybe start with you, Holly.
Sure. So there is, excuse me, the Northwest Atlantic Seabird Catalog that public and private sector have already been putting their data in. It dates back to the 70s. And there do exist some permissions on the data in terms of access. It's not, I don't think, online yet at this point, but it's managed currently by NOAA, the National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science. And I even just put in a request for it the other day. So anybody can email the right contact and access those data. And that's, I'm not sure if it's required, but it's highly recommended, as I understand from BOEM, that developers put their data, project level data into that database.
Thanks. Sorry,
You're good.
I
No,
wasn't
no.
prepared for it to come down here. Yeah, it's so important in my opinion. I mean, as someone who works a lot on very wide-ranging species, it takes but oftentimes we're doing science in very local places, right? But you have these species that are just passing through and actually covering these huge ranges. And when it comes to understanding the effects of offshore wind on species, if any, then you're trying to disentangle that from, well, maybe it's just climate change, or maybe it's a prey shift or something else. It's so important to be able to compare data between projects that's happening in different locales across the region to be able to get a better understanding of the whole picture. And so that's where open, data sharing, I think, there's many reasons it's important, but that's kind of more of a key one from a scientific perspective to me. I think one other thing I would add is that open data sharing really helps support trust in an industry by stakeholders, and it levels the playing field for tough conversations sometimes around mitigation measures that might be needed and why those are, or, particular findings. And the more open we can be with data and, just those conversations in general, I think it will really benefit the industry's success.
Thanks, Francine. Just a couple things to add. I actually would like to hear from Brian. I haven't dug through all of the all of the permits to see what's actually required. Two things. One is just to reiterate that issue of data sharing. These data are expensive to collect in some cases. They're fairly precious in that way. There are existing consortia, like Holly just mentioned. There's also the North Atlantic Right Whale Consortium that has all of the sighting records of all the right whales back to 1970 or earlier than that. So those things do exist, and there are mechanisms to pull the data out. I will also say, just from we dealt with this or addressed this in the Project Wild proposal, and that was one of the things that we went to the developers, and I mentioned the external advisory board, and when we formed that, which is primarily developers, although now it has NGO representation, state and local government representation. But when we originally set that up and got the letters from the developers, many of them included clauses about sharing data and that wildlife data. I mean, they have proprietary wind data and bottom characteristics and all this kind of stuff, but the wildlife data, that was what we wanted to, and they were quite forthcoming. And I think that was a really good sign in putting all this together. And then, the elephant in this particular room is RWSC, of course, that is working very hard to aggregate data sources, identify where they are, and working very closely with Pat's lab here, who's been a data provider for a long time. So there's a lot of efforts in that realm, and it really is very important. But I'll leave the last word to Brian.
I think Emily knows this is near and dear to my heart. Because it's such a weird question, data sharing. And everybody comes to me and say they're not sharing data. Well, what data is not being shared? And it's into, well, where is it? Oh, it's just in this report. Oh, it's not in the format that I want to be able to share. So it's like data sharing falls under such a large umbrella. So I want to say to the front that all data is shared. Now, when it's shared, what is shared? I think those, when you dig into that actual question in more detail, you get into these nuances of, we have a project where we're just trying to can we get all the grab sample data in the same format so that it could be aggregated and used across projects? Because I don't want to necessarily have to dig into every construction operations plan that has all the grab sample data and some of the photo imagery from the seafloor, and then try to compile that myself. I want it as a researcher in a publicly accessible database where I could just query grab samples and all the grab samples show up. So getting to that point, I think there's still a ways to go. But the data is often, especially I think what we're talking about, some of the environmental data, it's a lot easier to share than some of the proprietary data. But there is also concerns around sharing data prior to that getting that permit, right? There's a tremendous investment, and a lot of this is some of it is federal dollars, and all federal stuff is shared as soon as we can get it. There's sometimes there's the ability to Doug to publish on it before he puts it all online. But there's all of the federal data will eventually be made public. On the stuff that's collected, through private funds, they may want to say, I'll share this in its full entirety, when when the project's approved, because you have your permitting, you can, put it all out there. It's oftentimes it's data that's supported and included in the construction operations plan. It just may be in like a PDF document and that type of report. And again, not in some publicly accessible database. So it is something that we continue to work on, building the infrastructure that can eventually ingest all of this, getting standards. RWSC and ROSA, as was mentioned, are working on data standardization so that, how to ingest all of this when it does come through, and using something like the National Centers for Environmental Information and CEI to, actually, database, house all that data. We didn't even get into PAM data, passive acoustic monitoring data. Yeah, that's a whole nother, conversation about that. And there's even DOD's got concerns about, putting too much of that out there. So anyway, I do love it. It is a complicated, it's not as simple as why don't we share the data? It is, let's talk about what data you need and what you're looking for. And we can figure out, if we already have it, where it's housed and how to get it to you. So.
That's great, Brian. Perfect.
I'll just add one more thing to that, but emphasize everything that everyone said. We talked during the day today about the different points along the offshore wind industry development process where innovation is needed or new technology. And I think data management and data storage and data dissemination is one of those places that we didn't mention today. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to do that. We're going to be collecting terabytes and terabytes, and already have collected terabytes and terabytes of data. We don't want to lose it. We want to still have it 10, 20 years from now to go back and do additional analyses. And cybersecurity and keeping data organized and available to all of us is something that's going to be really important. And so in terms of additional opportunities for innovation, I'd like to highlight that. How much time do we have left, Brian? Okay, let's end with a good philosophical question.
More than 5.
Okay. So
Is the alcohol set up outside?
So maybe I'll close to another question that each panelist can take a stab at here. That's a little bit more philosophical, and that is in the grand scheme of things. So we know that our ocean ecosystem is constantly exposed to multiple natural and anthropogenic threats and stressors. So in the big picture, what is offshore wind? How does offshore wind play into this landscape? What do we see relevant to marine mammals and seabirds and some of the other ecosystem components that we talked about, and the things that they face? Are you worried about offshore wind? Is it a major concern? And if so, what are those things that you want to emphasize? Maybe we could go down the line, starting with Holly.
Sure. I think one of the main topics to address for seabirds and other wildlife are cumulative impacts. So regional assessments rather than project level assessments, thinking about migratory species and how a lot of work has been done at the project level to estimate exposure and risk to specific project sites. But then when you put all of the projects together up and down the eastern seaboard, which is, I think, what is it, 25 now or something like that, that seabirds as well as marine mammals are passing right through on their migratory routes, that I think that is a concern. And I know that is part of the NEPA process, that cumulative effects need to be addressed. So, but I think the question is how. And there have been some studies recently in Europe to address, basically try to quantify that from, like I talked about before, habitat induced displacement and being able to address the actual potential impacts to birds specifically. So we're, oh, can you not hear me? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, okay, I can hear myself now. So estimating take, and then estimating, being able to estimate resource equivalency of take. So what it would take to compensate for that. Those are two big questions that I think we need to address for, at least for birds.
Thanks. This is a tough question. First, I'll say that the federal government, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, takes all threats, seriously. That all the, what we term often the impact producing factors that the project may have. I will say also, we have in every EIS, there's an appendix. I don't know how many people look at, but we have an appendix of all the cumulative effects and all the impact producing factors, and not just from offshore wind, but everything else going on the OCS. So that's what, our true cumulative impacts assessment is we're trying to look at, there's a lot of other ocean uses going on the OCS, whether we're talking about marine vessel traffic or fishing or Department of Defense operations. We try to put those all in perspective, and where does offshore wind fall into that mix? And for some things, it's offshore wind is on the lower end of the spectrum, and for some things, offshore wind may be on the higher end of the spectrum. There's no one else that's really putting the number of structures on the OCS that offshore wind would. But some of these other things that we discussed, it's a very small fraction of the amount of activity. You'd be surprised when you actually do some of these spatial analysis exercises of how much activity is actually on the OCS. So maybe that's and the other part of me is like, as a public civil servant, what's important to me is what's important to the public, right? So we're often reacting to what is the public, telling us is the most important thing that they're concerned about, and we're putting resources to those things that the public is telling us that they have a concern about. So two things: check our EISs and our cumulative impact assessment, and especially that appendix, and keep commenting, and look forward to your participation in future public meetings.
Thanks, Brian. On the risk continuum, I think it's important to to look at it from the risk assessment standpoint, and that being in this case the risk to individual species or populations, and also obviously a big part of that risk assessment is what we know and what we don't know, or the famous unknown unknowns, right? So it's just to break it down a little bit, if I just stick with baleen whales, the major risk is and concern is pile driving. I mean, there's no two ways about that. I think the surveying, the geophysical surveying, we have a pretty good handle on. We know sources, we have them fairly well characterized. They're comparatively not as loud, as I said, as other sources. Once installed, I think there's some really interesting data out of Europe, again, with respect to pinnipeds, so seals and sea lions, and how they use wind farms. And in fact, they do use them, and they are food sources for those animals. They go straight out from their haul outs right out to the turbines, and they go turbine to turbine to turbine to turbine, looking for food. So that is, we can learn a lot from that. And what I'm not going to do is assign a risk level to that, because it's providing food at that time. What happens at the end of the life of those wind farms, I think, is a topic we haven't really had time or taken the time to discuss today, because it is a whole nother set of things. I do think that as far as the major risk to baleen whales of pile driving is that it is mitigatable to an extent, as I mentioned, not completely, and it is loud. There's no two ways around that. But there are things that we can do and are being done and planned for. I do think there's some interesting opportunities, and we'd have to evaluate them. And that is things like what's done with the scour protection and how do we strategize that and how do we do that wisely so that we enhance the area around it rather than it being detrimental. And once the scour protection is there, it's pretty static. I mean, I know it's checked and it's, maybe revised or what have you, but for the most part, it's there because that is also, relatively speaking, allowed activity. I think that's probably all I would say. I think from in the grand scheme, I'm not nearly as familiar with all of the activities that are going on in the OCS, but I can tell you sometimes when we're out there on the water, it's pretty busy between large ships, medium size fishing, recreational fishing, commercial fishing. It can be a fairly busy place. I do think some of these larger scale things like the oceanographic issues are we can't solve them right away. Do we know enough to be able to start? I think so, but that's one scientist's opinion. And we have information like the energy and the turbines. We also have data that we're not tapping, like our colleague at Rutgers, Josh Kohut, who's part of the WOW program, has every minute, he has radar data from Cape Cod to Cape Hatteras. And those long range radar go out and they measure the surface currents of the ocean every minute for the last 10 years. And so can we say anything about the wind stress and the importance of wind and the influence of wind? Yes. Can we use those data for models? Yes. Can we say that the turbines are not going to affect whatever part of it? That's an empirical and modeling question. Also, as a typical scientist, I'm not going to give you a straight answer. But I think, in the overall risk continuum, offshore wind concerns me a lot less than other activities.
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, maybe just to zoom out a little further. I mean, I think, there's no doubt that climate change is going to have devastating impacts on our ocean environment. There was a recent IPCC report that got into detail about some of those ocean and marine impacts that, was pretty, even for someone that works in the field, it was, a pretty sobering read. So we need offshore wind, absolutely. But we also need to protect our wildlife and habitats that are already struggling with other human caused stresses. And as I said earlier, we can do both. NRDC is super optimistic about our ability to be able to do both. But we need to be willing to be proactive when it comes to mitigation measures. And we need to invest in and then use, some of the technological solutions that are available to us to help address some of these potential impacts. So I spend a lot of time reading about and getting excited about noise reduction technologies and service operating vessels that we learned about earlier that can keep crew and maintenance staff and technicians at sea for a couple of weeks. So maybe they can travel more slowly out to the project site and reduce that, lethal vessel strike risk. There's new improved ways to detect where marine mammals are, including through satellites, which is pretty neat. And maybe we can use robots to scan floating wind infrastructure for marine debris. So there's a ton of opportunity out there, I think, that will help us, achieve our dual goals. There's lots of tools, and we just need to kind of lean in and use them.
Excellent. Thank you all. That was a tough question. I would not want to have been asked that question. But I'm the moderator, so I can do whatever I want. We're going to do one more quick one. And this, again, we'll kind of have a zoom out to a bigger picture. What opportunity is there to inform the public as we go along collecting data and making findings, analyzing this information and coming to conclusions about what's going on? And perhaps we can go down the line again and talk a little bit about how the work that you all do, how do you engage with the public and ensure that the results of your work is getting out there? And how can folks who are listening in the room and virtually stay in the loop with what we're finding when we're out there monitoring wildlife and the environment with respect to offshore wind?
I was going to suggest we flip the order, but I'll take a stab at this.
Sorry. You're right.
I think So in terms of interacting with the public, I mean, I'll just say straight out that, so this working group that I lead under the Atlantic Marine Bird Cooperative, it's an open group. Honestly, anybody can join. It's multi-sector. We have NGOs, consultants, industry, academia, and who else did I miss in there? Pretty much everybody. And it's a large group of technical subject matter experts, but and we do pride ourselves on being able to provide technical expertise, but that's not to say that getting external stakeholder feedback is, of course, a big part of that, right? Understanding concerns and how to address them. So I guess that's where I would start. And if I think of any better answers to that, you can come back to me.
I think maybe I'll do a opportunity for data sharing or public. Was it public involvement or data sharing or both? But I'll put a plug in for the Department of Energies, or I think it's actually PNNL that runs it, is the Tethys Marine Exchange website. So that's another great resource for anybody. They've just recently completed, this SEER video series. I forget now what SEER stands for. I forget. Pardon me for being a federal employee without knowing the acronym. But the Tethys website is a great resource. It's got stuff from around the world. It's not focused on just domestic research and studies. And so there, I think there's and on there too, you can sign up for their news blast and find out where there's opportunities, where there's meetings occurring. And, I would highly recommend anybody to sign up for their newsletters. BOEM is just one piece of the puzzle. So I don't want to diminish, we have a website, we have public meetings all the time on different projects that we have going on, whether it's, we have, meetings like this, or we also have staff up in Maine right now talking with fishermen. We have, public meetings around specific projects like public hearings and, talking about studies and through a National Academies group that we have. So, it's a lot to keep track of. And I think we almost hear more from folks that it's information overload. How do I focus, in on, wow, there's so much going, wow, I said, wow, there's so much going on. How do I really choose what to engage in? And I think that's what the challenge is picking what you can engage in. Maybe it's even just a local group, like a university group that's, interested in the topic and, wants to get involved. So lots of resources out there, and maybe not a great answer. I don't know, but I'll hand it over to Doug.
Synthesis of environmental effects research.
There's SEER. Yeah. Synthesis of environmental effects research. Thank you.
Perfect. I would say there's two things that I want to say. One is, as far as the actual field research, people oftentimes get frustrated that information is not available quickly enough. But just paint you a quick picture. So, we get in the boat, go out on the water, which takes, a lot of preparation in of itself. We put a tag on an animal, we follow it around, something happens, something doesn't happen, the animal responds, it doesn't respond, right? We collect the data somehow, whether it's via satellite or a archival instrument or whatever it is. We take that data back and make something out of it, right? It takes time to move through those data in such a way that we can be confident about what we say at the end of it, right? And so we can do quick looks and say, this is kind of what we saw, or this is how much data we collected. But part of the scientific process is making it repeatable, but also that you analyze the data in a transparent way, and also one that you come to some conclusions. So in that sense, the publication of the data is the final result. We understand that takes a long time and can be frustrating. But again, it's not that anybody's trying to withhold. It just takes time to move through those things deliberately, and we can have confidence in the results. The other side of that, of course, is that there's a lot of stuff out there that's published that either we've done or other people have done, and I try pretty hard to to get out there and talk to everything from local groups to events like this to international meetings and draw on other things that are going on, not just my own work, and try and help put that in the context of what's going on. So I hope that helps. But I think those, for us, there's two, well, for me, at least in thinking about it quickly, there's two distinct pathways, and try to work both of them at the same time. That being said, I'll give you one quick example of one of the early products of the WOW project has been this gap analysis of what species, just bearing down on a couple species, what do we know, what do we not know, and those kinds of things we can make available pretty quickly, because it's really just a literature search of what's known and what's not known. So we think about those things. We don't want to make them available prematurely, but at the same time we realize the need for information. So yeah, that's all.
Thanks, Dirk. I don't have too much more to add. I will just say that, from NRDC's perspective, having an informed public and membership about offshore wind is really important. Getting the facts out there and, helping the public understand what's going on with offshore wind. And we've learned today how complex it is, and it can be a little overwhelming, I think, for people, just from the outside trying to figure out what's going on off their shoreline or in the state. So one of the ways that we do that is through our expert blogs. I have an expert blog, and my colleague in the Oceans program, Alison Chase, who's our senior policy analyst, also blogs regularly on offshore wind. You just have to Google our names and NRDC and you'll probably find it. So there, we kind of highlight key developments on the offshore wind and wildlife front, note if there's any opportunities for public input. For example, BOEM and NOAA developed a draft North Atlantic right whale and offshore wind strategy earlier this year, which we were really pleased to see. And there was a public comment opportunity around that. So we highlighted that. And then one of the things I try and do is if there's any kind of really key science papers that are super relevant to offshore wind, I try and develop a blog just to break down some of those key findings and how it's relevant to our decision making. So I would just plug our expert blog page. But yeah, I think in general it's a challenge to make sure that we're communicating our science and everything that we need to do in an effective way. And so I don't know if we have time in the break, but if you all have any thoughts on that, I'd be interested to discuss those with you, because I feel like it's something we could always be doing better.
Thank you all. And I'll also just add a little bit there, is that I hope that as we move into more of an implementation phase for the RWSE science plan and supporting research, that RWSE is able to play a role there too, and helping publicize and make folks aware of significant findings. And maybe it's more geared towards the regulatory community, so that information gets used in decision making and less towards the public. But maybe there's some room to grow into the public space too. And so look forward to working with you all on that as well. And with that, I want to thank our panel today. Please join me.